Hello, welcome to part 2 of a 3-part tutorial series consisting of 9 videos on how to write a philosophy essay. In this video, I will provide you with 13 basic tips for writing your essay. The minimum I would want you to walk away with if you don't want to watch part 3. But even if you plan on watching part 3, I would encourage you to watch this part as well. Not everything that I present in this part is covered in part 3. Also, because it is an essentially a do's and don'ts list for writing a philosophy essay, you might find that it gives you a checklist to always keep handy. This section is also more suitable for students who prefer pointers over procedures. Here are the 13 tips. Some of the tips in this part are very intuitive, and you are probably familiar with them. Others are a bit more technical. Pause and repeat when you find it necessary. Since the videos are based on text, it should be easy for you to find the spots you want to repeat. You can also skip the tips you feel confident about. By the way, did you notice that 2/3 of what you see here are tips for writing a good essay in general? Tips for writing a good essay in general are also essential for a good philosophy paper, so I included them in the 13 tips. If you need general writing help, I strongly suggest you visit your college's writing center. Take the numerous writing workshops most colleges offer and use online resources or books on good writing. Ready for tip 1? Tip number 1. Let's start the first tip with a little background. The 3 main kinds of philosophy essays correspond to 3 stages of our thinking about a philosophical idea. I shall call a philosophical idea also a thesis, or a position, or a claim. The first stage is trying to understand it. An essay that corresponds to that is an exegetical essay. The second stage is evaluating and being critical of the position. The relevant essay is a critical essay. As for the third stage, it is an attempt to build on what has been said before and get to the bottom of the question, and is expressed with a constructive essay. Now, all 3 of these stages and the corresponding kind of philosophy essays have one important thing in common. All 3 kinds of essays are forms of why or why because papers. Not who, not when, not how. So the first thing I want you to remember is the term because. This is essentially what you are saying over and over again in your essay. Here's a little exercise for when you're walking your dog, washing the dishes, doodling, or doing something else. Find the many ways in which you can say because. I will also give you some examples in the next part. What does because give us? It gives us reasons. To say that a philosophy paper is a why because paper is to say that it is a paper that provides reasons for a thesis or a claim. A philosophy paper is not history, not a narrative, not a review, not a description, not an analysis of the motivations of a philosopher, not a scientific proof, although it might in very small amounts include some of those. A philosophy paper is also not merely a personal opinion. It is not a personal opinion because it is backed by reasons. As a qualification, I must say that philosophy's relation to literature is contested in academia. But even in an essay for a philosophy course that presupposes a strong relation between philosophy and literature, you'll still be saying because, and because, and because. Why? Because philosophy is all about reasons, reasons, reasons. Remember this first tip as the why, because tip. Tip number 2. Most assignments have more than one part or question. Read carefully and answer every part of every question, unless instructed otherwise. If there is any part you don't understand, ask. Isn't it sad that so many students don't do well on an essay because they did not understand the question or the whole question? I cannot count the times I've written on an essay, you have not answered the essay question, or you haven't answered the whole question. Don't do that. Tip number 3. Learn the basic form of a philosophy paper. There are many ways to write a good philosophy paper, both structurally and stylistically. But beneath almost all of them lies a basic form. Here it is. There will be a claim, and there will be reasons for that claim. What I've written as the claim goes by many names, as you may know: idea, thesis, proposition, and so on. So, to repeat, in your essay you will include a claim and the reasons given for that claim. If you watch tip 1, you know what I mean by reasons. Then you will state objections and the reasons given for those objections. If your essay is an exegetical one, that will be the totality of your essay. What I mean is, if your assignment only asks for you to describe what you've read in your own words, this is the form you would use. Before I continue, let me stop and clarify something important. Anna and Brad need not be different philosophers. They could be the same philosopher arguing on contrary sides of an issue. In their writings, philosophers typically offer objections against their own thesis in order to be more convincing by also defending their views against those objections. Think of what you might do if you were going to ask a family member for a favor. Beforehand, you might think of the objections the family member might make, so you'll prepare reasonable and convincing answers to those objections ahead of time just in case that happens. In this example, what the philosopher Anna is doing is the same thing. Also, just as what I've written down as Anna and Brad don't have to be the same person, they don't need to be persons at all. They could be positions, such as utilitarianism, rationalism, empiricism, externalism, relativism, materialism, constructivism, realism, and so on. Sometimes, depending on the course you're writing for, they could also be policies and decisions, such as one that a hospital ethics board has made. Keep that in mind. However, I will stick with Anna and Brad, just for the sake of consistency, but sometimes refer to Anna and Brad or other characters as philosophical positions rather than as people. As I said, before pausing to explain that bit about Anna and Brad, if your essay is an exegetical one, this will be the totality of your essay. But if your essay is to be a critical one, then you will include your critical analysis of the discussion between the two philosophers or positions. The summary of your critical analysis will be your conclusion. Your conclusion might be that you agree with the original claim, or that you agree with the objections, or that you think both are wrong, or that each makes a useful contribution to the discussion but falls short of a complete answer to the problem. Here you might ask what all the A's, B's, C's, and I's are, and if there's a difference between them. So, all of the lowercase a's, b's, and i's are reasons, answers to why questions. In this instance, a's are the first philosopher's reasons for her claim capital A. B's are the second philosopher's reasons against capital A, or the same thing, his objections. Your additional reasons for the conclusion you arrive at. I's are typically not in the reading material. Sometimes they come up in class or during tutorial discussion. But if you think carefully about the claim and the objection or objections to it, you will be able to produce those reasons yourself. In all cases, the need for I-type reasons is for you to practice analysis and produce reasons in your own words, rather than merely regurgitating material. As you might have noticed, I use the letter I to remind you that these are your reasons. Even in exegetical papers, you are almost always expected to do independent thinking, either in coming to a summary conclusion or in offering alternative interpretations of some passages. Regurgitation is not enough. I know that many of you will be wondering what right is supposed to mean here. That's a good question. The term right is used as a figure of speech here. A shorthand expression often used in philosophy to mean that a particular statement or thesis is sound, which is about the truth and validity of an argument. I covered the topic of soundness under tip number 12. For the purposes of the 13 tips section, right will stand for agree with thesis. Thesis is true and follows from true premises. And thesis is true and argument is valid. Later, in tip number 12, I will also point out the difference between truth and validity. Now that we have completed our little detour on what right stands for, let's return to the basic form of a critical philosophy essay. I am taking out the line that says your analysis so as not to clutter the page. Think of the conclusion as including your analysis. Let me give you all the alternative conclusions together so you can see the possibilities. This is the typical form of a critical philosophy essay. It may seem restrictive, but can be generalized to almost all the kinds of essay assignments you may get. Once you understand this basic form, you'll see that it's endlessly flexible. But there are too many variations on that form for me to cover in this tutorial. Let me mention one though. In this assignment, you are given Anna's argument, but no objections to it. So you take on the role of Brad. As for the form of the constructive essay, if the essay is a constructive one, then you are both Anna and Brad. The constructive essay is the most difficult kind of essay to write. You will most likely not be given assignments like this in early years. However, even if you were, rest assured that it is extremely rare that both Claim A and disagreements with Claim A will be expected to be produced by you. What you will do, as is done in higher level scholarly work that takes place when a new question is examined, is that you will do research looking for a Brad that fits the description of someone who would criticize your original position because he had criticized similar positions in the past, and then you'll extrapolate from that criticism. But you need not be concerned about that yet. I'm just mentioning this to broaden your understanding. If you come this far, good. Pat yourself on the back. We just completed the most complicated of the 13 tips, which is the basic form to use when we're writing a philosophy essay. Now we can move on to tip number 4. Write an introduction and a conclusion, even if you intend to delete it when you're finished. Before I tell you what a philosophical introduction or conclusion is, let me explain why I mentioned deleting here. Sometimes, when you've done the best you can do to edit your work and are still above the word limit, the introduction and conclusion can usually go without harming the essay. But don't delete your thesis statement. More about that in a moment. While I prefer to see an introduction and a conclusion in an essay, especially lower year essays, a few instructors might advise you against including introductions in your essay, and if they do, you better omit the introduction before you hand in the essay. But you should still write one. So what's an introduction in a philosophy essay? It is not those sentences that begin, "From time immemorial, philosophers have always argued about," well, fill in the blanks. This sentence should never be in any essay of any kind, and you should know that by now. If you did not know, then now you do. By introduction, what I mean is a formal introduction that includes a thesis statement and a plan of the essay. All of my students that started using introductions and conclusions improved their essays, and for very good reasons. First, because writing an introduction is your chance to confirm that you're going to do exactly what the assignment asks you to do. After you've written the introduction, check the essay question again. The introduction must match the essay question. Second, writing a conclusion is your chance to check that you actually did in your essay what you said you were going to do in your introduction. So if you have two sets of sentences like this, one in the introduction and one in the conclusion, they should have the same content, but introduction will be in future tense and conclusion in past tense. Tip number 5. As I said during tip number 4, even when you write an exegesis, Your reader wants to know how you understand the argument. She wants to know that you have thought the matter out for yourself, not merely regurgitated lecture and textbook material. One of the best ways to bring out your thoughts is to ignore secondary material. Only an upper year philosophy specialist can properly make use of secondary material. You'll find using secondary material distracting and usually confusing. So, put all your energy into engaging with the original articles, asking your professors and tutorial assistants for help when you don't understand a passage. Rule of thumb: do not read anything that's not on your assigned reading list. Another rule of thumb: the best way to express your own thoughts is with the active voice. So forget the advice of your high school teachers who said, don't use I and we, and learn to use the active voice again. By using the active voice, you can prevent one of the most common confusions in undergraduate student essays: confusing your own thoughts with the thoughts of the philosopher you're examining. When an idea comes from the philosopher, use the philosopher's name or the name of the position. If an idea comes from you, then write, I think, I conclude, I argue, and so on. And if you find yourself in agreement with the philosopher, write, I agree with the philosopher. When you use the active voice, you are taking ownership of your idea. The expression is open and honest. Here's a non-philosophical and passive active voice example that you're probably familiar with. Passive voice: mistakes have been made. Active voice: I made a mistake. If one of two people said one of these and the other person said the other, who would you be more likely to trust? I assume you're more likely to trust the one who takes ownership of his action by saying he has made a mistake. Also, the first one, the one that says mistakes have been made, is confusing. Who made a mistake? It's not very clear. The same is true in philosophical writing. Passive voice can confuse the reader as to which idea belongs to whom. You don't want your reader to be confused. If you are misunderstood, you risk getting lower marks on your essay. And not making it clear who said what puts you at risk of being seen as plagiarizing. On top of that, passive voice sentences are usually unpleasant to read and tire your reader out quickly. You don't want that. Of course, if your professor instructs you to use a passive voice, you must do so, but that is very rare in philosophy courses. Now we are almost halfway through our 13 tips. The next few tips will be shorter. No technicalities for a while. Tip number 6. Tip number 6 is about who you are writing for. Most students would write a better essay if they knew who they were writing for. Who is your audience? Surprise! Your tutor or professor will mark your papers, but they are not your audience. They take on that role only with graduate student papers and some upper-level undergraduate specialist papers. Your paper will be marked as if it was written for your peers, as if your primary reader, your audience, are your schoolmates. So, the audience you should have in mind as you write are other university students or educated individuals who have not taken the course you are writing for. That is why, as I will soon say again, you have to define and explain everything you did not know before you took the course and anything else that could be misunderstood unless explained. In fact, the best paper you can write, according to philosopher James Pryor, would be one where you assume that your audience members are not only your peers, but also lazy, slow, and mean. They are lazy, so they're not going to try hard to understand what you write. So you have to do all the work of explaining everything clearly. They are slow to understand. So unless you explain everything clearly in bite-sized pieces, they're not going to get it. And they are mean. They are not going to be very charitable. If your sentences are convoluted, they are going to assume that you don't understand what you've written. If what you've written has more than one interpretation, they are going to pick the sillier interpretation. They will never overlook a mistake. They are never going to fill in the blanks if you've skipped the step. If you have that image in mind while writing, you'll probably do quite well. The short of it is define, define, and define. Explain, explain, and explain. Anything that is not common knowledge must be defined and explained in plain language, such that another student cannot possibly misunderstand. Tip number 7. This is related to the previous tip. If you don't understand what you write, don't expect your reader to understand it. And if you think you can hide the fact that you don't understand it by quoting straight from the text without explaining the text, it won't work. It just won't work, trust me. It is better to write, I don't understand this part, than pretending you understand. As in this example, if you can also demonstrate that you did your best to understand a particular idea or passage in the book by explaining why you didn't understand it, it will count as honest intellectual work and likely get you points. If you write something like the above, you must also quote the difficult sentence or sentences. Pretending to understand will not earn you points. And that brings me to tip number 8. Tip number 8. You won't know whether you understand something unless you try to paraphrase it. Some students think that paraphrasing means replacing words with their synonyms. That is not paraphrasing. And some people think that paraphrasing means replacing one sentence with a sentence that has the identical meaning. But that is not paraphrasing either. There might be some exceptions to this, but for our purposes, replacing a sentence with the other sentence with an identical meaning is not paraphrasing. What I mean by paraphrasing is expressing a complete idea in your own words. The idea that you paraphrase could come from a whole sentence, or only part of a sentence, or many sentences, a whole paragraph, or many paragraphs. Your paraphrase can be very short or as long as a paragraph. It does not have to be the same length as whatever you are paraphrasing. A reminder before we continue. Every time you paraphrase, immediately write down the page number upon which you base the paraphrase. If you don't, it's going to be difficult to find it later. Paraphrasing is so important and so effective that you could write an entire philosophy paper without ever quoting. Use quotes sparingly and generally under these two conditions. 1. When the point cannot be made any more effectively than in its original form. 2. When you want to draw attention to a confusion, mistake, ambiguity, or vagueness in the original. Summarizing helps with comprehension as well, but do not confuse summarizing and paraphrasing with one another. A summary is different from a paraphrase, although summaries and paraphrases have in common the fact that they are both expressed in your own words. The purpose of a summary is to shorten a given text. You can shorten by highlighting its most important points or by using a writing technique that condenses without omitting. But the purpose of a paraphrase is not to shorten a text, even though sometimes a paraphrase might end up shortening a text if the original is too wordy. To repeat, a summary is always shorter than that which it is a summary of. But a paraphrase could be shorter or longer than that which it is a paraphrase of. If the original text is wordy, the paraphrase will be shorter. But because by paraphrasing you're trying to make the meaning of a sentence or passage as clear as possible, if the original sentence is very brief, ambiguous, vague, technical, or all of the above, your paraphrase is likely to be longer than the original. My next tip is related to this tip regarding the difference between paraphrasing and summaries. Tip number 9. Paraphrases must have references. Some students mistakenly have come to think that paraphrases and summaries do not need citations, but they do. Paraphrasing is not a way to get out of providing references. A paraphrase without a reference is of little use to its reader if your reader needs to check the original wording to see the context of the paraphrase. Paraphrases must have references because another purpose of that reference is for your reader to be able to verify what you have attributed to another person. Paraphrases require references also because references help you separate your own thoughts from the author or author's thoughts, just as using active voice does. References also help separate different authors' thoughts from one another. Finally, paraphrases must be accompanied with references because if you don't cite, you risk being accused of plagiarism. Even if it is clear you did not deliberately plagiarize, then you will lose marks for sloppy work because providing references is one of the things you are being marked for in a philosophy essay. The same is true of summaries. The only time you don't provide a reference for a summary is if your sentence or group of sentences is summarizing the entire article or assigned reading. If the summary is of anything less than the whole article, then you have to point out which pages it is a summary of. Let us become a little more specific about providing references, because citing is very important in academic writing. You must reference your sources each time you cite those sources, even if you put all direct quotes in quotation marks, even if you completely paraphrase the ideas to which you referred, even if your sentences is mostly made up of your own thoughts but contains a reference to the author's ideas, and even if you mention the author's name in the sentence. One of the most important things I learned when I took a workshop on writing a philosophy essay in my first year as an undergraduate was that it's better to oversight than to undercite. What I mean is that it is better to provide a reference than not. It's even better, of course, to learn exactly when to provide a reference. Until then, if you're not sure, ask your professor or tutorial assistant. If you cannot do that, just oversight. And in order not to lose marks on account of sloppiness, remember to be consistent with your citation style. Ask your professor which one she prefers. You might have difficulty with this idea if you have a misguided hang-up that citing makes you look intellectually inferior. Quite the contrary. Citing brings you into one of the oldest forms of philosophical writing, dialogue. When you cite another philosopher, you have joined an ongoing conversation in the philosophical community. And that's something to be happy and proud about, not embarrassed. Now for tip number 10. Most students I've known, when they use long or complex sentences, tend to lose their train of thought. They are also more likely to make logical and grammatical errors that make those sentences ambiguous or worse, incoherent. Unless you have confidence in your writing, based on consistent good grades, for example, stick with simple, to-the-point sentences. The irony here is that good writers tend to use simple sentences more often than poor writers. I mean, of course, there's exceptions to that. But please don't use a model for your writing those sentences from your assigned readings that take up a whole paragraph. Those sentences are usually the result of many revisions and professional editing. And occasionally those sentences are also the product of bad writing. Bad writing exists in all disciplines, even philosophy. Related to this, you must also always avoid pretension. Good philosophy is profound, but its profundity does not come from highbrow or fancy language. I've seen many a potentially good philosophy paper ruined by attempts at flowery writing or by use of uncommon words. On that note, avoid synonym finders as much as you can. When you use synonyms, only insert the synonym if you are already familiar with the word. If you are not, you run the risk of sounding absurd or clueless, or even making your reader think that you're trying to cover up plagiarism. In his book, Writing Philosophy, which I recommend, philosopher Louis Vaughan reminds us that pretentious writing usually hides emptiness. If you want to read more on that, it's on page 45 of the 2006 edition. Like a pastry, Vaughan says, the whole thing will collapse as soon as it is punctured. You might know all of this already from other classes that involve writing, but I cannot emphasize it enough. The same goes for the next tip, which is also about writing. We have 3 very short but just as important tips for writing a philosophy essay left. Tip number 11. Your paragraphs should be clear and simple. That means one idea per paragraph. That is the standard in contemporary academic writing. Paragraph breaks are a signal to the reader that a new thought is going to be introduced. In this way, paragraph breaks make comprehension easier. You already know from your own experience that an article separated into meaningful paragraphs is much easier to read and much clearer than one that consists of a rambling block of sentences. And also, isn't it true that you need to take a breather every so often without losing your spot on the page? Paragraph breaks are perfect for that. Do the same thing when you write. 2 more tips to go. The first is about the difference between truth and validity. Tip number 12. Recall my mentioning what I meant by when I say a certain philosopher is right earlier. I said then that to be right philosophically meant to have a sound argument, and that that sound argument has a true conclusion arrived at from true premises supported by a valid argument. Now, many beginner students confuse truth and validity because of the loose use of the word valid in ordinary conversation. You must have heard your friends or even family say things like, "This sentence is valid." Let's put an end to that. Sentences are never valid or invalid. Sentences are only true or false. Only arguments are valid or invalid. Memorize this for now until you get around to fully understanding what the terms mean. Validity and truth is discussed in most lower-level philosophy classes. I also discuss truth and validity in more detail in the 3rd part of this tutorial. Part 3 of the series consists of an introductory video and 1 video each for the 6 steps of writing an essay. Truth and validity is discussed in step 2. But for the time being, just remember the following. If you mention a particular sentence in your essay, only talk about truth or falsity, or probable truth or falsity. Do not say that the sentence is valid or invalid. Use the term valid and invalid only if you mention a particular argument in your essay. Validity is about the form of the argument. It is about logic. In other words, to say an argument is invalid is to say that the argument is illogical. To say that it is valid is to say that it is logical. Here's a hint for later on. A logical argument may have falsities in it, and an illogical argument may have truths in it. So a thesis conclusion that is true will need true assumptions, in other words, true premises, as well as correct logical form. Now for our last tip, as important as all the others. Tip number 13. Proofreading is not revising. Proofreading is what you do after you have revised. In our part 3 of this series, I will give a complete list of what to look for. Here are the main things to look for when proofreading. Accidental deletions, grammar, formatting, punctuation, spelling, references, and typos. When you proofread, you will find yourself recovering an accidentally deleted word, or half a sentence, or a full sentence or paragraph. You'll catch your typos and spelling errors. You'll put punctuation where you forgot to. By proofreading, you can also save yourself from charges of plagiarism by adding references you missed putting earlier. And the happy news is that you will be able to do most of your proofreading even without knowing the subject matter well enough. So you can save yourself from losing more marks by proofreading even when you're not happy about the philosophical quality of the paper. But this is not just a matter of marks and applies to everyone, novice or genius. I want to impress upon you the thought that handing in an essay without proofreading it is like putting a dirty dish back in the cupboard without washing it. It's an act of disrespect towards the next person who encounters it. That completes part 2 of this 3-part tutorial series on writing a philosophy essay. Part 2 is independent of parts 1 and 3 and was meant to be a medium-level difficulty tutorial consisting of my list of 13 key tips for writing a philosophy paper I would like you to take away with you from this tutorial series, even if you don't watch the videos in part 3, or even if you watch them, but then forget them. I like part 2 because it's a nice list of do's and don'ts. Pause the video here if you want to review the list of tips we just covered. The next part, part 3, is the most technical in this series, so I've broken it into 7 separate videos. The first video is the introduction and gives a glimpse of what philosophy does. The other 6 videos each cover one of the 6 steps in the philosophy essay writing process.